and it's the approval for physical infrastructure and rolling stock, which is probably the one that you're going to get most restrictions on in some respects, although everything needs approval at the end of the day. So major infrastructure projects and the introduction of new trains can be the biggest and most obvious changes with the highest safety risks, certainly the most immediate ones that you might need to address. Approvals tend to happen at the end of the safety management process. So a full approval requires that all the hazards have been addressed, all the systems are known to be working together as intended. All the safety I's must be dotted and the safety T's must be crossed, if you like. So all these things have to be in place in order to get approval. And also note that when we're looking at major infrastructure change and things, these things can sometimes happen in phases. And so every change of situation will need some kind of approval. So how are changes approved? Well, really it's down to the infrastructure controller to see how their infrastructure is used and what goes on within it. So there has to be some body within the infrastructure controller that must take on the responsibility of approving changes. This body or panel or board, they get different names, is the one that if you're working on a project will have to approach at some stage with approval requests. So you'll specify what you're seeking approvals for, and you provide evidence that all the associated hazards have been considered. I'll just emphasize that evidence part. When a board meets to provide approvals for a project, they will already have reviewed the situation. They would have looked at all the safety evidence that's there. They would have looked at potentially independent safety reports that have been done. There has to be traceability of safety evidence on which approvals are then given. So we're going to, if you imagine you're on a project, you've got all your information and you go in there to seek approval. Would you think it'd be a scary thing? I mean, I've done this a few times, and yeah, you do get a little bit apprehensive about appearing there. Going before an approval panel could feel a little like going before a judge and jury, going to pronounce a verdict on the project. And it can be quite scary if you think about it in the wrong terms. This is a particularly scary panel if you ever end up in front of them. Of course, that's not really what they're like. Approval panels are made up of knowledgeable and experienced people. They're there because they understand the issues, they understand how the railway operates. They're going to meet to discuss several requests, and you'll get a specific slot to talk to them. And when you do that, they'll be concentrating on your project, your issues. They may even have a sense of humour. They're very normal people, but as I say, they're in a position of authority and responsibility. They are the ones who will be approving operations to go ahead. Well, why do we end up needing to consider restrictions at all to operations when we get approvals? Should a project not have resolved all these issues prior to starting and seeking operating approval? Well, there are all sorts of issues. To start with, major works have to be planned a very long time in advance, 6 months, a year, much longer than a year sometimes. You can't really work out all the issues when you're in the early planning stages and just putting marks in the calendar saying, we're going to have operations starting there, we're going to do major changes to the infrastructure at this point. It's in the diary, but you don't know all the work yet, all the issues, because the assessments haven't been done, the changes haven't been tested. What you don't want to do though, given how you're planning everything out, when you get to that stage, you don't want delays. Delaying works really can be expensive. So, okay, we get to the point where we're going to make changes to infrastructure, but we know that some problems haven't yet been addressed. Very often we'll go ahead, not unusual, just to go ahead, but knowing that there are issues that need to be sorted out before we go into operation. And some of those issues, unfortunately, will still be there when we get to the crunch point, the point where a decision has to be made whether to begin operations. Major projects are complicated. All sorts of things come up, all sorts of problems happen. So it's not that unusual for things to be considered as workarounds or restrictions at that point. You also have to bear in mind that cancelling service is very expensive. So sensible and safe ways need to be found so you can proceed in going back into operation as quickly as possible. That's what restrictions are for. They allow us to get back to operation. There were some limitations and controls in place. You have to remember that it's not just financial cost, there could be damage to reputation, there's all the disruption to all the people who use the railway. So it's quite important to get services back as quickly as you can, and still doing it in a safe way. So let's think about what kind of restrictions could be put in place. First of all, you could do things like reduce the frequency of service, so you don't have so many trains so bunched up together. Maybe we need to reduce the speed of trains because there's something which is not safe in running a full speed service. There could be issues with the types of rolling stock or the lengths of trains or the configurations that we have on the rolling stock. Maybe we have to consider the hours of operation because of other things going around on the railway. We could have geographical limits so that parts of the route are closed to services until those particular areas are completed. Or we have specific operational management conditions. This could be all sorts of things. Very often they involve putting in extra staff to manage the safety conditions. Of course, what we can also do with all these, there's also a limited duration of approval that the certificate can be given for. So an approval board can say, well, we'll let you operate for 3 months, but then we expect you to come back and tell us what improvements have been made. And this is a good way of ensuring that people don't drop the ball, don't just say, oh, we're done that, we're working now. Because if things aren't quite as they should be, close but not quite, you can then just make the certificate for a temporary period. And of course, what you can do as well is mix and match all of these things. So you could say have a limited duration approval during which specific rolling stock will not be permitted to operate in a defined part of the route. So these are the kinds of conditions that might be put on in order to ensure that safety is not compromised. So quick example of what I mean by management conditions. Let's consider the case of an automatic train control system being employed on trains running through a tunnel. So a train which doesn't need drivers is running through a tunnel, or intended to. One of the hazards that have been considered is what happens if a fire occurs? Well, in that case, the train should either turn back if it's a fair distance from the fire, or if it's come very close to the fire, it should try and run through and pass the fire as quickly as possible. Now, in the case where the automated process is still having unresolved issues, but they want the service to go into operation, they need to consider what to do. So an approval board may decide to stipulate that all trains have drivers when running through the tunnel, so the driver can make the decision as to what to happen and talk to the signal control and so on. And that kind of restriction will stay in place until the issues are resolved. At that point, a new presentation will be made to the approvals board, and if appropriate, the restrictions can be lifted. So you go into service with a restriction, you look to remove that afterwards. Services carry on, but we have some restrictions in place. So another example considering train and infrastructure incompatibility. Now, in this case, introducing new passenger EMUs, electrical multiple units, was meant to occur after another project had replaced legacy read track circuits with axle counters. That project got delayed. Now, the issue was the new EMUs are quite light and sometimes they're not reliably detected by read track circuits. So there was an issue bringing new trains into service, but the infrastructure wasn't ready for it. So a solution needed to be found if you wanted to do it. So it was decided as one of the conditions to increase the detection probability and to have sets doubled up. So instead of just a 3-card set, you must always run them as a 6-card set until the axle counters are introduced, and that increases the probability of them being detected. Now, the thing to remember is all restrictions, although they may allow services to operate, they always have a knock-on effect. And they can be quite hard to manage. So in this case, if you're going to get new rolling stock incrementally introduced, whilst the old rolling stock is effectively retired, at some point, if the issue isn't resolved, you will start to have really big operational issues. Maybe you can't run all the services that are on the timetable because you haven't got enough trains. They're doubled up. You have to start missing particular ones off the diagram. Or you may have to keep some of the older trains for longer than anticipated. And that brings you up to problems of where do you stable them, how do you maintain them, and all the rest. There's always a downside to having restrictions. In a way, that's also good because that gives you the desire to solve them and not just carry on with the restrictions in place. So just to conclude this little chat, and I think I'm reasonably on time. Cost in terms of disruption, reputation and financial losses to delaying services can be really severe. So we use restrictions as a formal way of controlling risk and providing the means by which services can operate. Now, these restrictions are not a punishment for failure for the project. They're there as a route to future full operation. So you can see them as limitations, but you can also see them as enablers of service. They're there to get you into service and then be lifted as the issues are resolved. So another way of looking at operation restrictions. They're there to get services operating, to keep the railway running. So that's my brief webinar. I know we started a tiny bit late, but I think we've got a few minutes. If anybody wants to bring up any issues, observations, or questions at this stage, be interested to hear from you. Well, anybody there? Anybody want to say anything? Has anybody got direct experience of presenting to an approvals board? How many people have done that?
Hi, Madeleine.
Hello there.
Hi, this is Tracy. I've had some experience delivering to an approvals board while I was at Transport for London.
Yes.
I delivered to a signaling panel. Yes, it can be a bit, if you're not really prepared for the panel, it can be a bit disheartening at times.
Yes, and
so
sometimes you
could
be.
Yes. So it's just ensuring that you have all the evidence that you need, and you can basically defend your point, and just to prove that you covered all the bases in terms of hazards and how you're planning to implement. So just ensure that you've covered everything in terms from a RAMS perspective.
Yes.
And to just deliver to the panel.
I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And being prepared is the key. The worst thing that can happen is if someone comes to you, the project manager comes to you an hour before and said, oh, such and such isn't here. Can you present this at the approvals board? Oh, no. But you must always be honest with them. They already know most of the problems when you go in there. So that's the key.
Yes. Yes, and I like the part that you said they are all human, and it's true. It's similar to doing a normal interview. Just do your preparation, and just be able to just ensure that you can answer any question they probably put across. Even try to cover things that are outside the box.
Yeah,
You know, just to ensure that you cover all the bases.
absolutely. You must remember, they're not there to trip you up. They're there to be helpful. Yes. But it's such a formal process, it can feel quite intimidating. I think that's the issue some of us find sometimes.
Yes, yes, it is.
Lovely points. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Anybody else with some thoughts?
Hi, this is Manoj.
Hello there. Hello, Manoj.
Yeah, so inside our company, where we built metros, this is a regular activity because the timeline of getting every system validated before it goes into revenue service is very less. So we always put restrictions, and also after the safety case, there is a process to follow, which is the safety authorization. So there will be a set of restrictions which will be add, and once it is validated, then only we step by step remove the restrictions and can do it. I mean, at a complete, like you told initially, like the speed is one parameter for sure, and the frequency of operations. These are some of the points which we also carry out so that the risk or the probability of this is reduced, of a risk is reduced.
Do you find it's the same kind of restrictions every time you bring a train into service? It might be slightly different causes for it.
In service, during the service, we have, once the final design stage is complete and once the train is handed over to revenue, then there is another set of people who takes care of these issues, and there is a 8-step process to address the safety, where we start to, if any issue happens, then it goes through kind of an immediate resolution, mitigation, and then go for a final resolution on that, and then implement it on the complete fleet. So that is a different step, which is there in the service kind of organization. But whereas in a design, we take care till the time it goes into the revenue service.
So I think, some great point. I think everybody has to work together to solve the problems and get the restrictions lifted and understand where they are. And the only problem I ever see with that is when a train manufacturer introduces a new train and there's a contract that says, well, it's not up to spec, we're not paying you for it. And then they start arguing about what the problems are instead of trying to solve them. And, you know, it's good when they all work together and they have an idea why the restrictions are there, and let's work to get them resolved. That's the proper way of doing it.
Yeah, so the restrictions are applied, and since we started this in India as a new organization, there are less questions. It is very well treated, and people are ready to cooperate. So
that's good. That's excellent. Okay. One last point. I know we're, do apologize, we now hit the 1/2 but we're almost on schedule. Anybody want to bring up a last point, question, observation?
I just want to add a small remark on this. The lifting of the restrictions also, I mean, that's the downside of it. You can start the service, but every time you lift the restriction, that means there's a configuration change. You have to submit the safety case again. You have to go to the approval board again. So more restrictions you have, that means that many times you go to the approval body.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's worth planning to delay a few restrictions coming off.
Yes.
To just hit several of them at the same time.
Yes, that's right.
There are practical limitations on how often the board will meet and everything else, and you've got to squeeze in amongst all the other projects. So the management of all that process is actually another issue, which I haven't covered in this at all, but it can cause all sorts of issues.
That's right, yeah.
Quite right. Okay, now I'm going to close out this session, but a couple of things I want to do. First of all, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you for those little comments at the end, which were great. I hope it's got some thoughts amongst you working, and it agrees with your own experiences that you've had on the railways. first of all, I'll just finish to say there's going to be other webinars. These will come out weekly, just these half-hour sessions. The next one we have scheduled is by Dr. Mikkel Verma, which is going to be about cell determination. That's next Friday. Friday after that, Rishi is going to be presenting on acid condition assessment. He's got a new way of looking at how to assess acid conditions. And to finish off, Stuart is going to be doing a really interesting EMC. EMC is always interesting because I don't understand it at all. So whenever someone explains it to me, I find EMC fascinating. So there'll be a talk on EMC and possibly a little bit of demonstrations to get you understanding it a little bit better in Stuart's talk. And just finally, to remind you, we're all part of Intellex's training faculty. We give some certificates out to students at the beginning. We have a whole set of courses if anyone's interested. You can find these on our website. They're for specific things. We do a safety module or a RAM engineering module. We combine these to RAM certificate courses and also some more advanced ones, which include systems engineering and things. We do the EMC courses with Stuart, which are fantastic as well. And this click works, yes it does. To remind you also that all our courses are certified as for CPD points, and you can check that by going to the CPD directory at that address and looking up Intelex Consulting with that email address, with that web address.